Thank you, Jay, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to everyone listening in this afternoon. Thanks so much for participating, and I look forward to an engaging discussion after I finish my presentation. Just to sort of frame this a bit better, my background is education in East Africa, particularly focusing on the roles of curriculum and textbooks in this era of massive international education reform. Particularly in this world of heavy rhetoric that tends to era of heavy rhetoric that tends to oppose policy and practice. Textbooks are by far the most immediate means of accessing state policy, and that they're essentially tools that represent both a nation state's ideals and its priorities. While my previous work has focused on students' perceptions of identity, I couldn't help but pick up on representations of other in textbooks and curriculum in Kenya. And particularly in light of the current events with Somalia and Somalis in Kenya, I began the project I'm going to share with you today. So just to sort of outline what's ahead, I'm going to give just a very brief background on education reform and conflict in post-conflict states. Although Kenya is not technically either, it has a steady stream of conflict, so it should be considered as such. Then a brief background on the government of Kenya's treatment of Somalis in Kenya since the colonial era, Somalis' access to education in Kenya, and then the findings from a textbook analysis, and then a conclusion basically just outlining what the relationship is between conflict and curriculum in Kenya. So the silver bullet, education is the silver bullet to essentially all development problems, is the way it's positioned in development jargon, particularly with Millennium Development Goals. Providing all girls and boys with access to primary school education is seen as the key way to speed up poverty alleviation. And yet, particularly in conflict and post-conflict states, it sits at this intersection where it's the promise, it holds the promise of policy development versus the anxiety of practice, particularly among groups that were just previously at war with each other. Revised national narratives are positioned as a clean slate to unite these warring sides under one unified national identity. And we've seen this in many countries. Bosnia and Herzegovina, Guatemala, Germany, Rwanda, South Africa, and South Sudan are but a few examples over the historical spectrum. While education certainly can offer students a sense of stability in the midst of conflict and during post-conflict reconstruction, the development of revised textbooks to address the changing environment and the changing curriculum is given cursory, if any, consideration. But as always, the lines of conflict are never state, and Kenya presents an almost overwhelmingly complicated model for the challenges of curriculum and conflict. With an on-again, off-again conflict with Somalia since the 1960s and a sizable Somali refugee and Kenyan Somali population, the ways in which Kenya represents Somalia, its transboundary conflict with Somalia, as well as Somalia's ongoing civil wars matter. As the cliche goes, when Kenya sneezes, East Africa catches a cold, just highlights the importance of stability in Kenya as it relates to stability in the East Africa region. Just so that we all have the same geographic foundation, I just wanted to highlight where it is exactly I'm talking about. You can see that they share quite a bit of the Indian Ocean coast, which certainly plays into the conflict in terms of tourism and piracy, as I'll get into later. So the history of Somalis in the Kenyan state is complicated. This is certainly a brief overview and not the focus of this project, but it does provide the groundwork. And I'm happy to share additional resources, both academic and from development professionals, for anyone who's interested. So looking at the northeastern province, there's been a long history of neglect and marginalization. The area is comprised of predominantly of Somali pastoralists, And until 1943, there was not a single primary, intermediate, or secondary school throughout the whole of the then named Northern Frontier province. And then in 1962, the British colonial government commissioned a survey among residents of Northeastern province on their thoughts of secession. And an overwhelming majority, nearly 80%, voted to secede. However, British priorities certainly lay more with a safe exit strategy from a crumbling empire than the concerns of the people who would then become Kenyans. So they ignored these requests. In 1963, then they declared the areas of the Northern Frontier District, the Northern Eastern Province of Kenya. Consequently, protests spread. They became violent. And soon after Kenyan independence in December 1963, the first president of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, declared a state of emergency in the province, beginning the Shifta War. For the rest of his presidency, as well as his successor, President Moi, the northeastern province was intensely militarized. In 1977, reports of Somali government agents issuing passports to Kenyan Somalis to go to Somalia for military training led then Vice President Moi to announce a screening of Somalis. And through the 70s and 80s, this intensified. Identity checks and state surveillance also increased in urban areas dominated by Somalis, specifically Nairobi and Mombasa. For example, police in Nairobi raided homes, businesses, hotels, restaurants, and matatus, checking for identity papers. For example, also another example, Somali women married to Kenyan men were detained until a valid marriage certificate could be produced. So recent developments. Events in Somalia and the global politics around Islam and Islamic identity have certainly exacerbated these problems. The increasing number of Somali refugees in Kenya and the overcrowding of the available refugee camps, which I'll talk about more on the next slide, have placed huge burdens on the state and who are working to continue to delineate citizens versus non-citizens. With the rise of al Shabaab, the radical Islamic terrorist organization based out of Somalia, Kenya's invasion of Somalia, Somalis in Kenya have experienced increasingly militarized environments. Raids in Eastleigh, a suburb of Nairobi often called Little Mogadishu, and other Somali neighborhoods in Nairobi as well as Mombasa have experienced regular raids. On October 16, 2011, Kenya launched Operation Linda Nchi, or Protect the Nation in English, a coordinated military operation between Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, French, and allegedly U.S. troops. Kenyan troops crossed the border into the conflict zones of southern Somalia in the hopes of wiping out al Shabaab. This offensive was in large part a response to a rash of kidnappings along the coast, an increase in al Shabaab's recruiting efforts in Nairobi, as well as in Dadaab refugee camp. I've just included one picture. This is a relatively recent, a year ago bombing along Moi Avenue of a shopping center. What's important to notice is that al Shabaab's attacks have not targeted expatriates. They're not targeting wealthy Kenyans. They're targeting everyday working class Kenyans. Those have specifically been their targets when they're looking at bus stations, bars, restaurants, those sorts of venues. So I've mentioned refugee camps. The threat has been a return to Dadaab, particularly for those refugees in Nairobi. Dadaab is a town in northeastern province and hosts 3 refugee camps, making it the largest refugee center in the world. This is an aerial view of it. You can see it extends as far as your eye can see. Dadaab is currently hosting 4 times more refugees than it was originally designed to hold, most of whom are Somalis. Refugees are mostly unemployed, and 2/3 of the population are younger than 35. Apart from general insecurities related to crime, political insecurities that afflict the camp range from ethnic tension to religious extremism. As a result, many Dadaab refugees try to leave the camp and escape illegally. Official figures suggest that there are around 46,000 refugees in Nairobi. However, unofficial estimates are nearer to 100,000. It's essentially impossible to count because of the hesitancy for refugees to make themselves known outside of Dadaab. Their neighborhoods are well known, however, and are frequently subjected to police raids, as in Eastleigh, Little Mogadishu, I mentioned previously. And they are often arrested for a lack of documentation. Despite these dangers, there are a number of reasons that Somali refugees come to Nairobi from Dadaab. They're looking for greater livelihood opportunities and increased security. Many reported feeling unsafe. There are a number of incidents of rape and killings in Dadaab. Many others report that they're frustrated of having to live in the camp where there's essentially no chance of employment and a harsh climate. So they've moved to urban areas to seek economic independence in the hope of a better life. So what does this all have to do with education? A little background on education in Kenya. In 2004, fulfilling a campaign promise, President Mwai Kibaki, and one of the first things that he did as president, implemented universal primary education, guaranteeing both refugees and nationals access to primary education. So, however, despite this, a number of primary schools request an admission fee, which is paid to the headmaster. Refugees, Somalis really have little recourse, and that many lack awareness of their rights and that this is illegal. So either they pay the fee or they keep their children out of school. Another main issue is that many refugee families need official documentation to ensure that their children can enroll in public school. However, many newly arriving Somali refugees either opt not to register with UNHCR for fear of being told to go to Dadaab, or they don't register when they're in Nairobi for fear of having to return. As a result, there's an increasing number of urban refugees who are not registered and lack documentation. So ultimately, there are a number of children either out of school, or particularly among Somalis, they may send their children to madrasas in Nairobi. However, there is little to no data available on this. So moving to the methods of this project. So I wanted to reiterate, I wanted to look at textbook representations of Somalis. I focused on primary school, standards 1 through 8, which translates exactly in the US to grades 1 through 8, because of the focus on universal primary education. The series I've picked, I scanned two covers there of standards 7 and 8, are published by the Kenya Literature Bureau. Those were selected because they're currently the only publishing house to receive the ministry's approval for adequately addressing the quote-unquote emerging issues, which I've highlighted here. Considering the aforementioned focus on education in conflict and post-conflict states, juxtaposed with Kenya's quote-unquote Somali problem, the way Somalis are represented in textbooks has significant impact both on public consensus and in identifying the administration's stance both on Somalis and refugees. So the first set of findings, there's a clear and very strong sense of national unity among younger grades through standards 1 and then the early pages of through standard 4. Here's just one example. From standard 2, our school neighborhood, people are social. They live together in a community. People living together form a society. They do many things together. The things we do together are known as social activities. We carry out social activities to enjoy ourselves. Social activities help make us friends. Look at the following pictures. And then they provide a series of pictures. The first picture, most tellingly, is an image of 11 men kneeling on prayer rugs bent in prayer. So there's this clear image and message of tolerance, acceptance that was clearly identifiable in standards 1, 2, 3, and in the early sections of 4. However, as you progress through the grades, clear lines are drawn between us and them. Standard 4 on citizenship clearly identifies who is a citizen and who is not. There are people who live in Kenya, but Kenya is not their country. These people are foreigners. The bold is in the textbook. They are citizens of other countries. In Kenya, a Kenyan citizen is treated differently from the way foreigners are treated. These benefits are known as rights. So it's clearly distinguishing nationals from non-nationals in terms of who has rights and who does not have rights. Now, on its own, this passage doesn't say much. Yes, foreigners, it's just the technical definition of what a foreigner is, but it begins to set up a series of how the textbook and the curriculum wants children to understand who is us and who is them. For instance, a good citizen reports foreigners. Foreigners must be allowed by the government to visit our country. If one of us hides a foreigner in his or her home, it is our duty to report to the authorities of such a person. The foreigner may be dangerous to our country. So first of all, foreigners must be allowed. That's clearly not, we welcome foreigners to our country. And then it's the myth of hiding a foreigner and that the correlation between foreigner and dangerous. It's not subtle what the message being sent here is. Citizenship is very important. What it means to be a good citizen is very important, particularly in defense of country. The Standard 5 textbook provides a number of examples for students on what they should be to be a good citizen. And one of those examples is defense of our country. As they say, non-Kenyans may not be interested to make Kenya a good place because they do not live here. Even though we have an arming to protect us from countries, it is also our duty to defend our country. We can do this either by also taking up arms or talking in defense of our country. Patriotic citizens love their country and will never talk bad things about it. If a person talks bad of our country, we should defend it. This makes us patriotic. Remember, there is no better country than ours. So not only should we be worried of foreigners, but we should actively defend ourselves because they do not have our best interests in heart, and we need to remain the best country in the world. Now then, again, this rhetoric is not necessarily unusual in terms of there is no better country than ours. Most nations and nationals feel this way about their homeland. However, to see it stated in the juxtaposition of foreigners want to do harm to our home, it is quite telling. So standards 7 and 6 really focus on conflict and the number of negative impacts that conflict can have. I've highlighted a few. On growth. Some parts of Eastern Africa have been affected by war, thereby having a low population. Somalia, Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea have been involved in war in the past. The clans in Somalia have been fighting each other for the last 10 years. Apart from people being killed, others run away and become refugees in other countries, thereby depopulating their countries. So it's interesting that in the textbooks it's sort of displacing Kenya's role in the conflict, as well as they're fighting each other and they become refugees. And all of the students would be aware of what is a refugee. Some of them themselves may be internally displaced persons, which presents a number of other complicated relationships. Other negative effects of conflict, tourism. Tourism accounts for at least 10% of Kenya's income each year, and the impact of piracy cannot be highlighted enough. For instance, after the raids on, right before the rash of kidnappings along the coast, several hotels in because tourists just do not want to go there for fear of kidnapping. So as the textbook has said, tourism is a very delicate industry. It is easily affected when there is insecurity in a country or region. Whenever there are disturbances that affect the freedom of tourists, the area becomes unpopular to the tourists. So again, the textbook is speaking in very general terms. What would be interesting and is the next part of this project is how are these messages mediated in the classroom through the teacher. But again, many students would be well aware of the impact of the conflict in Somalia and Somalia piracy on tourism, particularly those living along the coast. Another negative effect of conflict is on African economies. Some countries go to war against one another. For example, Eritrea and Ethiopia, Somali, Burundi, Rwanda, Sudan, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. This makes people become refugees. Whenever conflicts and wars take place in a country, the people's way of life are disrupted, causing insecurity and instability in the country. Africa has the largest population of refugees in the world. Refugees are not productive as they depend on support from other people. So again, not subtle. Compare this to foreigners, the depictions of refugees, depictions of us versus them, foreigners being dangerous. There's a clear line drawn between nationals and non-nationals and who should be afraid of whom, and the need to identify non-nationals, particularly in terms of maintaining a safe community, maintaining a safe country. It should be noted that in all of the textbooks, standards 1 through 8, the only mention of conflict in Kenya comes once during the standard 7 textbook. It mentions civil conflict in Kenya during 91 and 1997 because communities were incited to fight one another over political leadership. I should have stated earlier these textbooks were published in 2004 and 2005, well before the post-election violence. However, the juxtaposition between they fight each other and then we have to deal with the consequences to the conflicts that have gone on internally, again, is quite stark. The message is not subtle. The final finding is on external migration. Our country has also had an influx of foreigners, put in parentheses, refugees, from our neighboring countries such as Rwanda, Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Somalia due to political instabilities in those countries. The effects of immigration into Kenya are that the country may benefit from many foreign investments as these offer employment opportunities to our youth. One of the negative effects is that the movement of people from war-torn countries encourages the movement of illegal arms into the country, which are used by criminals. The foreign cultures of these people end up affecting our cultures negatively. While they've clearly made an attempt to balance the effect of immigration, as they called it, external migration, employment opportunities versus negatively affecting culture and the impact of illegal arms trade, there's no parity, to say the least. Additionally, it should be noted that Kenya has as I mentioned, Kenya has a sizable IDP population who also arguably cannot contribute to the economy in the same way that those living in stable communities can. So what does all of this mean? As I've mentioned, there's a clear line between practices of the state and curriculum with regard to Somalis specifically and refugees more broadly. What is a refugee and how we should view refugees is overwhelmingly negative. Refugees present danger, refugees present crime, and they negatively impact our culture, however that would be understood. And again, while the activities of al Shabaab are not representative, Somalis in Kenya shoulder the consequences through both educational policy and as victims of their violent attacks. While many Somalis in Kenya are actually escaping al Shabaab, which is one of the reasons that they've become refugees, also because of the civil war in southern Somalia, they have somehow been unable to both escape the violence and find a supportive environment for recipient countries. Overall, the history of institutional marginalization is continued in the government of Kenya's curriculum. This exclusionary process actually and potentially empowers extremist groups, as it's been identified that al Shabaab has used Dadaab as a recruiting base, but now the government of Kenya has also recently been identified to use Dadaab as a recruiting base as well. So where it ends, it's difficult to say. Where to move forward from this point is also difficult, as in the impact of textbook reform and curriculum reform is a long, lengthy, controversial process. Textbook reform happens maybe every decade because, again, of time and cost considerations. However, in this regard, there's little drive for reform in that This is a institutionalized process of neglect and marginalization. That's everything for me. I am open to your questions and comments. Again, thank you for listening in. And I guess I'll hand it back over to Jay.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Foulds. And while our guests are typing their questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, just one quick one, just because I don't know much about the situation. How does the curricular development correlate to other sorts of expression? And our previous speaker has talked about entertainment venues and social media. How does the curriculum development and the way it's implemented across the various institutions correlate to those types of things?
Well, the process is still quite antiquated. I spoke several years ago with one of the editors of Kenya Literature Bureau on the logistics of the process. The ministry hands down the curriculum. It's published. It's not easily attainable, but then the editors go over it. They write out essentially a framework for the textbook. They have authors that they hire who then write the complete book, and then it goes through several rounds of editing. In terms of other institutions, there's very little input, but in order to get the ministry's approval, you do have to fulfill, X, Y, and Z components of the textbook. But to say, I wouldn't then say that the ministry is separate from the Ministry of Education is separate from the other ministries. However, I'm not entirely sure how much oversight there is or how much collaboration there is between the two.
Okay, and that kind of dovetails with that kind of dovetails with a question by Dr. Rishapi. That the question is, who produces the texts or the curriculum? Do they interact with governing groups as far as content is concerned? And are there counter texts available or in use that offer different narratives?
There actually are. Kenya has, across the continent, Kenya has one of the most vibrant publishing industries of any other country, and arguably of any other country in the world, considering the level of competition. Kenya Literature Bureau is identified as a parastatal with very little government funding. But what's interesting is that the government-funded Jomo Kenyatta Foundation is not as popular a series both with headmasters, teachers, and students as the Kenya Literature Bureau. Kenya Literature Bureau, in fact, tends to be a bit more progressive, which is one of the reasons also I wanted to focus. If this is the progressive model, then we need to redefine how we understand progress. Did I answer the question? I'm not entirely sure.
I think so. And there's another question that comes in, and it's actually, there's some narrative in there in question. And Catherine, if you would put where you're from, that might help lend some context to it. Let me go ahead and read this for you. Catherine says, there is no oversight on curriculum development in Kenya. There has not been. And your research basically portrays poor curriculum development by a cadre of educators who are confined to a neocolonialist mindset and may not have been exposed to any other school of thought. And it goes on, and then this bottom paragraph here is really what kind of struck me. It says, it's also Catherine says that this is also a fact that the teaching methodology in public school limits freedom of thought. Kids are not encouraged to think outside the box because of the standardized exams abide in the curriculum. And therefore it's better to cram the concept so that the kids can pass the exam instead of allowing and encouraging out-of-the-box discussion in the classroom. So I think the root of the question is, do you think that it's the curriculum that is the issue, or is it the teaching methodology that they forced to align with the curriculum as opposed to going with other narratives? What do you think about that?
Well, I certainly agree that the teaching methodology in Kenyan schools is problematic. Because of the implementation of universal primary education, there was a mass enrollment. It's now, I believe it was 160% increase in enrollment. So now it's not uncommon to see schools with a classroom with one teacher and 80 to 100 students. Many of the classrooms that I've been in have been that ratio. So yes, that is certainly an issue. This is where textbooks become even more important. With those sort of teacher-to-student ratio, textbooks represent the only teaching aid many times teachers have. They tend to have a chalkboard, chalk, and then textbooks. So it's not, I don't know necessarily if it's entirely helpful to say it's one or the other. They certainly intersect, and there are problematic issues about both. I wouldn't necessarily want to lay any sort of, blame isn't the right word, responsibility is not what I'm looking for either, but in terms of the constructs that teachers are dealing with, curriculum is highly problematic. Even though students read and then are told to memorize certain passages, that doesn't then mean it doesn't have impact because they aren't engaged in critical dialogue. If anything, the curriculum becomes more dangerous in that framework.
Interesting. Can you expand on, while we're waiting for, okay, thank you. Catherine is a researcher at the Marine Corps Center for Advanced Operational Cultural Learning, CAOCL. Great question, Catherine. Could you expand on some of the differences between the curricula in Somalia and Kenya in regards to what are their primary influences?
Well, my research focuses on Kenya. I don't know much about the Somali education system, particularly considering how decentralized it is. But in terms of Kenya, certainly it could be argued, and as Catherine mentioned, sort of neo-colonialist policies come into play. Much of, arguably, the largest influence is the British metropole. You see, even though there are a number of indigenous publishing firms, they still adapt the framework designed by British colonial educationists. However, there have been certainly attempts to quote unquote indigenize the material. I've done research where I've gone in and I've asked students to tell me essentially what it is that they see in their textbooks with regard to gender identity and gender equality reforms, and there's a complete disconnect. So it's, while their most significant influence might be the UK and the framework of textbooks and learning in the UK, there's this complication in terms of indigenizing the curriculum, representing a progressive agenda, and colonial ramifications of educational policy.
And that's an interesting thought there, this idea of the indigenizing the material. If as you say, that the curriculum is part of this institutionalized marginalization, where do you see, or do you see, the most movement or progress versus this institutionalized curricula?
I think it's certainly in terms of gender identity. In gender and education, textbooks tend to be the most popular form of research. There's been the most movement in terms of revising the way gender is represented, the way girls and boys, what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a man and a woman, etc. In Kenya, there has been some work on ethnic identity because of the tensions between ethnic groups. However, this has been sort of a neutralization process, kind of in the way that gender has been. We, our people, there's really no discussion of ethnic identity. And so, as with gender, as with race, when you pretend it doesn't exist, it doesn't get at any sort of the real structural issues. This is the same issue focusing on the issue of Somalis and refugees. They're not getting at why these people are refugees, what Kenya has done. It's they're coming to us, the dangers they represent, and the possibilities that they could potentially harm our homeland.
Great. See, on the curriculum development, either this indigenized process, this movement to do that, or the more institutionalized curricula, how much influence do outside factors, outside actors, have on the development of this? And if there is a significant one, which ones have the most impact?
I think in Kenya, they've, aside from what I was mentioning about the impact of British colonial policies, they've been able to really stand, relatively autonomous. The biggest impact has been the development community and the Millennium Development Goals, and this push particularly towards gender equality in education and international education reform. The challenge is that you're expecting a particularly Western framework to work in a non-Western environment, and it's in research, my research and others has shown that this is in fact counterproductive. It actually tends to be regressive rather than progressive. And then I think it's quite telling in terms of looking at the way that they've portrayed refugees, that I'm not entirely sure what the influence is. I don't know if there is any external influence other than the negative of how Somalis are viewed as a quote unquote drain on Kenyan social services, the Kenyan economy, particularly in terms of criminal activities, illegal arms trade, employment opportunities, those sorts of things. Tourism, certainly. I think the external influences tend to be less educational and more social, political, and economic than anything else.
Okay, and Dr. Sheppy down here asked a question that says, in terms of boundaries, how do representations focus on, or do they focus on national identity or ethnicity, or is there a push trend towards this Pan-African identities in the curricula?
In Kenya, I think it sees itself as the king of East Africa. The last time I was in Nairobi, someone told me that Nairobians see themselves as the Londoners of East Africa, which I've never heard that expression before. I found it extremely problematic, as I'm sure many Nairobians and Kenyans would altogether. But to the point where there is no push really for a Pan-African identity in Kenya, the examples of instability in the region outline every other country, with the exception of Tanzania, as being unstable. They highlight Rwanda, Uganda, Somalia, Sudan, now South Sudan, as problems essentially for Kenya to deal with. And that seems to be the general consensus, that these are problems that the country has to deal with. There has been recently a push towards resettling Somali refugees in Dadaab. There's an agreement between the two governments, Somalia and Kenya, to resettle those, despite the fact that the conflict is still ongoing, and there is no potential safety net for those once they're resettled. So definitely representations focus on the strength of Kenyan national identity. As the one passage said, there is no better country than ours. They're definitely not subtle about it. So in terms of Pan-Africanism, it absolutely does not exist.
Okay, and just to wrap things up here, what do you think, and put a practical spin on this, what do you think would be the most effective things that the West, whether it's the U.S. or any of the European countries, that the West can support this sort of indigenized progressive curriculum development without being counterproductive?
Oh, that's a good question. What can the West do? I don't stop thinking that it should do something. I'm not entirely sure. I feel sorry. I think in terms of when you look at the war on terror and the way terrorist organizations, and I don't necessarily mean U.S. policy, but a lot of times American perception, that in terrorist organization becomes representative of a people. And that's certainly what's happened with al Shabaab and Somalis in Kenya. All Somalis, anyone who might look Somali, anyone who has a Somali friend is a suspect. That there are raids on homes, businesses, buses. They're required to produce identification at the drop of a hat, is reminiscent of many of the apartheid policies of South Africa during the apartheid regime. So in terms of what the West can do in terms of intervention, I'm not really sure. I think that the West could potentially stop using Kenya as sort of an entry point for its concern with al Shabaab's activities. But that's a tricky one. I don't know. I don't know. And I don't think that the West knows either. I don't think that American policy has any idea what it can do, or otherwise it would be doing a better job of it.